I want to tell you a story about love, betrayal, and how a mother found herself again after being abandoned by her own son. If you've ever felt lonely within your own family, if you've ever given everything only to receive cold indifference in return, then this story is for you. And before I begin, subscribe to the channel so we can share more true stories together. Stories about family bonds, gratitude, and the power of forgiveness that can change a person's life. Now let me tell you what happened on my son's wedding day. My name is Margaret, and I'm 71 years old. That day, I wore a pale blue dress I had carefully kept in my closet for months. The dress I bought to attend my son Daniel's wedding. The reception hall in downtown Portland shimmered with light. People laughed, chatted, and took pictures. White flowers filled the air with a soft, sweet scent. I stood at the front desk, holding a small purse, my heart beating slow and heavy. A young woman checked the guest list. She looked at the screen, then up at me, slightly confused. Her voice was soft, but I heard her clearly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your name isn't on the list." I smiled, trying to keep my voice steady. There must be a mistake. I'm the groom's mother. She looked at me with sympathetic eyes, then gently shook her head. "I'm really sorry, ma'am. It's not here." Inside the hall, I saw Daniel. My son was talking with guests. A tall man dressed in a black suit, his hair neatly combed. For a moment, I remembered the days I used to cradle him in my arms. I called softly, "Daniel." He turned around, but the look in his eyes was no longer that of a son toward his mother. He walked over and stopped in front of me. His voice was low but cold. "Mom, why are you here?" I answered, my voice trembling. "It's your wedding. Of course I should be here." Daniel looked at me without a hint of emotion. "This ceremony is for family," he said. "You shouldn't be here." I heard every word, and also the sound of my heart breaking inside my chest. I didn't cry. I just smiled. "All right, I understand." I turned and walked away, through the laughter and the music behind me. No one called after me, not a single person. Outside, the Portland sky was drizzling. I stood still for a moment before stepping down the stairs. My dress was soaked, but I didn't feel cold. Only one thought echoed in my mind. My son just erased me from his life. I called a taxi. On the ride home, I looked out the window, watching the city lights blur through the rain. Images of my life replayed in my head. The night shifts at the hospital, the mornings I drove Daniel to school, the times I borrowed money to pay his tuition. I had given my whole life to my son. I once believed that a mother's love was eternal, but I was wrong, because my own son taught me that sometimes love isn't enough to stay in someone's heart. I didn't know that just hours after leaving that ceremony, a new chapter of my life would begin, a chapter I never dared to imagine, where I would no longer be the quiet, compliant mother, but a woman who finally learned to stand up for herself. After that wedding day, I sat for hours by the window, watching the rain fall on the street outside. Never in my life had I felt so lonely, but if I had to trace back where it all began, it would have been a long time ago. I adopted Daniel when he was 4 years old. Back then, I was 35, living alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of Seattle. I worked night shifts as a nurse at the city hospital, spending most of my time surrounded by the sounds of ventilators and the smell of disinfectant. One afternoon, I visited the children's shelter. Amidst the cries of many little ones, a boy was sitting quietly in a corner, staring out the window. His eyes were large and dark, filled with fear. The caretaker told me he had been left at the hospital gate months ago. No one came back for him. I didn't know why, but when his eyes met mine, I knew I wouldn't be able to leave alone. I completed the paperwork, and from that day on, Daniel became my son. The first few years were hard. I worked and studied simultaneously to qualify for a promotion. Some days I worked 20-hour shifts, slept only 4 hours, then got up again to cook, do laundry, and take Daniel to school. We had nothing except each other. Daniel was a bright child. He loved reading, drawing airplanes, and asking questions that made me laugh. During the rare moments I had free, I would take him to the park near our home, buy him vanilla ice cream, and watch him laugh among the pigeons. Just seeing that smile made every exhaustion disappear. When Daniel turned 10, I switched to an administrative position in the ER. The pay was lower, but it allowed me to spend evenings at home with him. I didn't want him to grow up alone. I once turned down an offer from a big hospital because I was afraid of being away from him. I always believed that if I worked hard enough, Daniel would have a better future. Time passed, and my son grew up. He studied well and earned a scholarship in engineering at a prestigious university. The day he received his acceptance letter, I hugged him, tears streaming down my face. I thought every year of sacrifice had finally been worth it. During his college years, I sent him extra money so he wouldn't go without. I ate instant noodles for an entire month just to buy him a new laptop. I never told anyone. I was simply happy I could provide for him. I didn't want him to know I had sold my only ring to pay for his final semester. On his graduation day, I stood in the crowd holding a small bouquet of flowers. When he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, I saw that radiant smile on his face. He looked down, caught my eyes, and waved. In that moment, I believed my life had been a success. A year later, Daniel started working in Portland. He rented a small apartment and began his new life. I sent him gifts and occasionally visited. Everything seemed fine until Sophie appeared. I met Sophie for the first time at a dinner. She was young, beautiful, confident, and worked in the advertising industry. At first, I was happy, thinking my son had finally found someone he truly loved. But after a few meetings, something started to feel off. Sophie spoke gently, yet there was always a sting behind her words. One evening, while I was cooking dinner at Daniel's place, she picked up her chopsticks, tasted the food, and said with a faint smile, "The food's a little salty. I wonder how Daniel even grew up with this kind of taste." Daniel stayed silent. I pretended not to hear and just nodded, quietly replying, "I'll cook it lighter next time." But inside me, something fell, something small, but it fell deep. From then on, the distance began to grow. My calls became shorter. My messages often went unanswered. Whenever I visited, Sophie would say they were busy working on a project and needed to maintain their privacy. Daniel also said, "Mom, I'm an adult now. Don't worry so much." I knew he didn't mean any harm, but his tone grew colder. He was no longer the boy who used to hold my hand when thunder scared him. He was busy, successful, and had forgotten the person who built the foundation for it all. When Daniel announced he was getting married, I felt both joy and unease. I prepared a gift, a white handkerchief I embroidered myself with the letter D. I wanted Sophie to carry it on her wedding day. But that evening, when Daniel shared the news, he said, "Mom, Sophie and I want a small, intimate wedding, just for close family." I smiled, thinking of course I was family. I didn't know that, to them, that definition had already undergone a change. 3 days before the wedding, I called to ask about the ceremony time. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Daniel said, "Mom, Sophie thinks you don't really fit the image we're going for. I'm sorry." I gripped the phone tightly, my heart stopping for a moment. All I could say was, "I understand." After hanging up, I sat in silence for hours, not because I was uninvited, but because I realized that for all those years, I had loved someone without truly knowing who he had become. On the wedding day, I still went, not to cause trouble, but because I needed to see my son one last time, as his mother. I didn't know that only a few minutes after stepping into that hall, my life would take a turn, one I never thought I'd be strong enough to face. That morning, I woke up early. The Portland sun was soft, the sky unusually clear. I brewed a cup of tea, sat on the sofa, and looked at the pale blue dress hanging in my closet, the one I had bought for my son's wedding. I had hesitated all night, but in the end, I decided to go. I thought, even if they hadn't invited me, I was still his mother. A mother doesn't need an invitation to witness her child's most crucial moment. I brushed my hair neatly and sprayed a hint of perfume. Before leaving, I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was lined with age, but my eyes still had their light. I whispered to myself, "It's okay, Margaret. Keep your heart calm." The ceremony was held in a luxurious garden filled with white flowers and golden lights. I walked toward the reception area, holding my small purse tightly. The staff at the desk looked at me politely and asked for my name. I told them. They checked the list, then went silent. A young woman pressed her lips together and bowed slightly. "I'm very sorry, ma'am, but your name isn't on the guest list." I heard her clearly, but still asked, "Are you sure? I'm the groom's mother." She looked at me, uneasy, and shook her head gently. "No, ma'am. This list was approved by the bride and groom. Your name isn't here." I felt a sharp pain in my chest. Part of me wanted to turn away, but another part urged me to stay. I looked around and saw Daniel stepping out from the stage area. He looked handsome in his gray tuxedo. His eyes met mine, and in that instant I realized something was gone. The love. All that remained was discomfort, as if my very presence spoiled the perfect picture he was trying to paint. He walked toward me, his voice low but cold. "Mom, why are you here?" I answered softly. "I came to give you my blessing." Daniel didn't meet my eyes. "You shouldn't have come. You know this is a small ceremony just for family." I replied quietly, "But I am family, Daniel. I'm your mother." He exhaled, looking away. "Sophie doesn't want you here. She thinks you don't fit the image we're going for." I stood still. That word, image, felt foreign, yet it cut into me like a small, sharp knife. I thought of all the mornings I woke up early to cook for him, the nights I sat by his bed when he had a fever, the countless times I stitched his school shirts back together. And now, all of that was dismissed for something called an image. At that moment, the bride appeared, Sophie. She was radiant in her white gown, her smile flawless. But when she saw me, that smile vanished. She spoke softly, just loud enough for me to hear. "You weren't invited. Please leave before people start noticing." Daniel said nothing, no defense, no word. I looked at the two of them, the son I had raised and the daughter-in-law I once hoped to love, and I understood clearly. I had lost them both. I smiled, a smile that even I didn't know where I found the strength for. "All right," I said. "I understand. I wish you both happiness." I turned and walked away, slowly, as the wedding music played behind me. No one called after me. No one walked me to the gate. As I left the garden, clouds began to gather. I stood by the roadside, waiting for a taxi, the wind blowing strands of silver hair across my forehead. A car pulled up. I opened the door and sat in the back seat. The driver asked, "Where to, ma'am?" I answered softly, "Home." My voice sounded strange, empty, as if it belonged to someone else. The car began to move. Through the window, I watched the glow of the wedding lights fade into the distance. I thought I would cry, but no tears came. There was only a terrifying calm, as if my heart had turned to stone. When the car turned onto the main road, I took out my phone. I opened my contacts and looked at the name Mr. Lewis, the lawyer who had worked with me for nearly 20 years. I dialed. When his voice came through, I spoke slowly, clearly. "Lewis, it's time to carry out the plan we talked about." He hesitated. "Are you sure, Mrs. Harris? Once we start, there's no going back." I replied, my tone eerily calm. "I've already lost everything, Lewis. Now it's time for me to take back the only thing I have left, my dignity." I hung up and leaned back in the seat. Outside, the rain began to fall softly. Drops streaked across the car window, blurring into long silver trails. In the dim light of the afternoon, I caught my reflection. A tired, aging woman, but with a new glimmer in her eyes, the spark of someone who has finally remembered how to live for herself. I didn't realize it then, but from that very moment, I had stepped out of the role of mother and into an entirely new journey. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat alone in my small house staring out the window. The streetlight cast a golden glow on the wall, my reflection faint on the glass, thin, still, and silent. This house was where Daniel grew up. His old desk still bore the faint pencil marks from when he first learned to write. On the shelf, a few of his childhood toys remained, things I could never bring myself to throw away. Everything here was a testament to a lifetime of sacrifice. I had lived for my son, loved him, forgiven him, and protected him. And in return, my son erased my name from the happiest day of his life. But what hurt the most wasn't being excluded from the wedding. It was realizing I had lost myself somewhere along the way, lost in the role of being a mother. I used to be a strong woman, with dreams, with a career, with dignity. And piece by piece, I gave it all up just to orbit around one person. That night, I made myself a cup of tea and called Mr. Lewis, my old attorney. His deep, familiar voice came through the line. "Margaret, do you really want to go through with this? I still have all the documents, but once it's made public, there's no going back." I answered softly but firmly, "Yes." It's time Daniel understood that everything he has didn't just fall from the sky. Most people thought I'd been just an ordinary nurse all my life, but few knew that my father had once been a businessman in Europe. When he passed away, he left me a significant inheritance, shares in several companies, a few apartments in Vienna, and a portfolio of investments I had never touched. I never told anyone, not even Daniel. I wanted him to learn independence. I wanted our relationship to be built on love, not money. But now I realize by keeping that secret, I'd allowed my son to look down on me. In his eyes, I was just a poor, aging mother who needed to be told how to dress appropriately for his image. How ironic. The house he lives in, I bought it. The car he drives, the down payment came from my account. And the engineering job he has, it was thanks to a favor I called in from my late father's former business partner. I didn't want to take those things back out of bitterness. I just wanted him to understand that respect is not something you beg for. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. The number on the screen was so large, even I felt a moment of disbelief. I had lived frugally all my life, spending little, saving much, investing quietly. Every digit on that screen was proof of decades of endurance, hard work, and silence. I called Lewis again. "Tomorrow," I said, "I want to transfer all my assets back to my name and cancel every payment connected to Daniel." He replied, "Understood, I'll handle it immediately." I sat still, listening to the tapping of his keyboard through the phone. Everything in my mind was suddenly clear, as if a long, unfinished painting had finally been completed. The next morning, I began packing. I gathered only what I needed, my passport, documents, and a few clothes. Everything else I wrapped up and called a charity to come collect. The house grew emptier by the hour, but my heart grew lighter. When you've already lost everything, fear no longer has a place. Before leaving, I stood in the doorway looking at the bare room one last time. I whispered, "My son, I'm no longer your shadow." I moved into a small hotel downtown. The room overlooked the river, morning light streaming softly through thin curtains. I sat at the desk, sipping coffee, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. Then I began drafting my plan in detail, cut all automatic payments for Daniel's house, transfer the property title back to my name, withdraw my guarantees for his loans, and finally ask the company where he worked to reassess his position without any special recommendations. I didn't want to destroy him. I just wanted him to face the consequences of taking for granted the person who built his foundation. That afternoon, Lewis arrived with a thick folder. "These are all your assets," he said. "Domestic and overseas. The house Daniel's living in has already been transferred back. Would you like to keep it or sell it?" I smiled. "Keep it. I want to see how he reacts when he receives the notice." Lewis hesitated, then asked, "Are you sure you don't want to talk to Daniel first?" I shook my head. I already did, at the wedding gate that day. When he left, I opened the window. The breeze carried the damp scent of rain. In the distance, the city lights shimmered. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, my heart felt weightless. I had spent my whole life being a mother. Now I was learning to be a woman again, someone who loves herself, makes her own choices, and doesn't need anyone's permission to be respected. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Today, I officially retire from motherhood. I will no longer watch my son's every step. I will no longer shield him from the consequences of his mistakes. From now on, I choose to live for myself, even if only for the few years I have left." When I put down the pen, I realized tears had fallen. But this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of liberation. 3 days after the wedding, Daniel called me. His voice was cheerful, as if nothing had ever happened. "Sophie and I are on vacation for a few days," he said. "Can you stop by to water the plants and collect the mail? Oh, and maybe tidy up a bit. Sophie wants the place clean when we get back." I was silent for a few seconds, then replied simply, "I can't. I'm busy." He hesitated. "Busy? Doing what?" I answered, calm but firm. "Busy living my own life." Then I hung up. An hour later, Sophie called. Her voice was sharp and high-pitched. "What's wrong with you? Cleaning up the house is nothing. A mother should help her son." I said quietly, "You're right. I was a mother, but not anymore." I heard her shouting something, but I had already ended the call. That afternoon, I sat by the hotel window with a cup of coffee. Below, cars drifted slowly through a light drizzle. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. No waiting for a phone call. No guilt over saying the wrong thing. No more being a mother to someone who didn't want one. A few days later, Daniel called again, his voice anxious. "My electricity got cut off. Do you know anything about that?" I replied evenly, "No, I don't, because that's not my house anymore. I stopped paying the bills." His tone rose. "Mom, what are you doing? You can't just cut off my power." I said, "You can call the electric company. You're the owner now. Handle it yourself." There was a pause. Then he shouted, "You're being petty. You always make everything such a big deal." I replied softly, "No, Daniel, I'm not making it big. I'm just setting it down." Then I hung up. From that day on, everything began to collapse. The company Daniel worked for received a formal request to review all employee files. I didn't intervene, just asked them to evaluate fairly with no exceptions. A week later, his manager called him in and handed him a thick folder, a record of poor performance reviews, technical mistakes, and customer complaints. No one was there to shield him anymore. Daniel was temporarily suspended. As for Sophie, things weren't much better. Her credit card, used for clothes and handbags every month, was suddenly declined. It was the supplementary card I had opened for Daniel years ago. When Sophie tried to use it at a boutique, the cashier smiled awkwardly and said, "I'm sorry, the account's been closed." Her face flushed red. She stormed out and called Daniel. That evening, their apartment was filled with shouting. Sophie screamed, "Tell me, why was the card canceled? Your mother did this, didn't she?" Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "Don't blame my mom. If you hadn't hated her, none of this would have happened." But even he didn't believe what he said. Deep down, he knew. I was doing what he never thought I could, setting boundaries. 3 days later, Daniel went to the office. On his desk lay an envelope. Inside was a termination letter. His boss, who also happened to be my late father's former associate, spoke briefly. "You need to learn accountability. You've been protected for far too long." Daniel didn't argue. He just stared at the paper, silent, and walked out. That same afternoon, a court officer arrived at their apartment. He handed Daniel an official notice. The property ownership had been transferred back to me. From that day forward, they had to start paying rent or leave within a month. When Sophie read it, she screamed and threw the papers on the floor. "This can't be real. This house is ours." Daniel said quietly. "No, it's my mother's." Sophie shouted louder. "You're a failure, a man who owns nothing of his own." Daniel didn't respond. He sat down, his hands covering his face. The apartment, once bright and lively, fell into a suffocating silence. That night, the police knocked on their door. The neighbors had reported shouting, breaking, and crying. Sophie was smashing dishes while Daniel sat motionless, like a statue. When the officers asked her to stop, she pointed at Daniel and yelled, "It's all his mother's fault. That cruel old woman destroyed our lives." One officer replied calmly, "Ma'am, this isn't your house. It belongs to Mrs. Margaret." The room fell utterly silent. The next day, a local newspaper picked up the story online. Young couple cut off financially by wealthy mother after their wedding. Public opinion is split in two. Some called me heartless. Others said, "She's just teaching her son responsibility." I read the article and simply smiled. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel revenge, just emptiness. That afternoon, Lewis visited with new paperwork, final confirmation that all asset transfers were complete. He asked, "Margaret, do you have any regrets?" I looked out the window where the sunlight was fading over the river. I said, "No, I didn't do this out of anger. I did it because something had to end." I knew that from now on, Daniel would have to live on his own. He would struggle, fall, and learn. Learn what it truly means to grow up. And for the first time in decades, I could finally live for myself. That night, I sat by the hotel window again. Below, the streetlights glowed golden. I thought to myself, maybe pain isn't punishment. Maybe it's life's way of teaching us to grow. Daniel was learning that lesson in the only way he could. A week after Daniel lost his job, I opened my phone and saw my name all over social media. It all began with a post from Sophie. She wrote, "My mother-in-law is a cruel woman. She pretended to be poor just to manipulate my husband, then cut us off completely after the wedding. Now we've lost our home, our jobs, everything. We just wanted to live in peace, but she destroyed it all out of jealousy." The post went viral with thousands of shares. People commented, "How horrible! How can a mother do that? That woman must be insane." I read everything. I didn't get angry. I didn't even feel sad. I just sighed. She had chosen to play the victim, and once again, I became the villain in everyone's eyes. 3 days later, reporters knocked on the door of the hotel where I was staying. They asked if I had anything to say about the feud with my daughter-in-law. I said simply, "I'm not fighting anyone. I just chose to step away from a relationship where there was no respect left." However, when I went online later, I saw that Sophie had taken it too far. She wasn't just twisting the truth. She was posting my photos, tagging my name in her rants. People hurled insults, mocked me, and flooded my inbox with hateful messages. That evening, a message came from an old friend. "Margaret, she's lying. You have to speak up." I sat silently in front of my screen for a long time. Then I opened my laptop. I knew it was time to tell the truth. I posted my own statement. No anger, no revenge, just the truth. Slow and steady. "I am the mother you've been cursing. I adopted my son when he was 4. I worked for 40 years to raise him. I quietly paid for his house, his job, his credit cards, but I never once boasted about it. I didn't cut anything off. I simply stopped. And when I stopped, they called me cruel." Then I attached the documents, copies of property deeds, bank statements, utility bills, and loan guarantees, all officially certified. The post spread quickly. People who had insulted me grew silent. Some even changed their tone. Maybe she wasn't wrong. She's just standing up for herself. 2 days later, I received hundreds of messages. Some said I was an inspiration to mothers everywhere. One woman wrote, "After hearing your story, I finally forgave my own son." But I knew Sophie wouldn't stop, and I was right. That night, she went live. Bright lights lit her face, her eyes red, voice trembling. "Hi, everyone," she began. "I know a lot of you believe her story, but she's lying. She's acting like a victim to gain sympathy." Viewers poured in. The comments exploded. "Prove it! Show evidence! Don't just talk!" Sophie's voice grew louder, shaky. "She recorded us! She's spreading lies and slander!" I was sitting in my hotel room watching the live stream, and I knew it was time for the truth to speak. I opened my phone, typed into the comment box, "Hello, Sophie. I'm watching. Would you like me to join you so we can tell the full story together?" Her screen froze. The chat went wild. "She's here. Let her speak. We want both sides." Sophie bit her lip, trying to stay composed. Under pressure from viewers, she finally nodded. "Fine. Let's hear what you have to say." When my image appeared on screen, the chat fell silent. I sat in my room, the river glowing faintly behind me, warm lamplight brushing against my gray hair. I spoke slowly, clearly. "Thank you for letting me speak. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to tell the truth." Sophie folded her arms and smirked. "Say whatever you want." I nodded. "All right, you said I made things up. Then here's a recording from our conversation a week before the wedding." I pressed play. Sophie's voice filled the room, sharp and unmistakable. "You're a burden. Daniel will never have a future as long as you're in it." The chat went silent. Sophie's face went pale. She stammered, "You edited that. It's fake." I replied calmly, "No. In this state, anyone directly involved has the legal right to record when being threatened or insulted. I only did it to protect myself." The comments exploded again. "That's really her voice." Poor woman. "How disrespectful can someone be?" I continued. "I never wanted revenge. I just wanted respect. I didn't take anything from you. I simply stopped paying for what I already bought. The house, the job, the credit cards, all of it came from me, and I have proof of every single one." I lifted a folder. Inside were copies of deeds, bank statements, and employment guarantees. My tone stayed calm. I once believed that love meant giving without condition, but maybe the only real condition of love is respect. Sophie looked at me, tears streaming down her face. You win. You've destroyed us." I shook my head. "No, Sophie. I didn't destroy anyone. I just stopped feeding an illusion." After that live stream, the internet turned upside down. People shared clips with captions like, "The strongest mother I've ever seen." "A lesson in self-respect." The hashtag #MeRespectMargaret spread everywhere. Sophie was fired from the boutique where she worked. Daniel's contract was permanently terminated. But what stayed with me wasn't their downfall, it was the silence afterward. No more hate, no more defense, just emptiness and exhaustion. I turned off my phone and stepped onto the balcony. The night air was cool, carrying the soft murmur of the river below. I asked myself, is this victory? Probably not, because every victory comes with a price. I had reclaimed my dignity, but at the cost of my only son. The next morning, a new message appeared on my phone. It was from Daniel, only a few words. "Mom, I'm sorry." I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't reply, not because I hadn't forgiven him, but because I knew that some apologies must be proven over a lifetime, not just a few words. After the live stream, Daniel and Sophie's world completely fell apart. The boutique where Sophie worked sent her a termination letter. The reason stated, causing reputational harm to the brand. She cried, begged, but no one listened. Daniel also lost his job permanently. The company sent an official letter ending his contract with a brief note attached. No one wants to work with a man who publicly humiliated his own mother. I didn't feel happy, nor did I feel vindicated. I only felt an emptiness, like an old house where laughter no longer lived. Online, my story was still spreading. Thousands of people shared, discussed, and praised it. They called me the mother who taught her son the most expensive lesson of his life. But in the silence of the night, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a survivor of a storm, because right or wrong, after all that, I had still lost my only son. 3 weeks later, Daniel sent a letter. Not an email, a real envelope with the messy handwriting I still remembered. "Mom, I don't know where to start. I used to think you just wanted to control me. But now I understand. You were trying to protect me from my own foolishness. Sophie is gone. She said she couldn't stand how people looked at us anymore. I've lost my job, my home, and my pride. But in the wreckage, I've started to see myself clearly. A selfish, shallow, ungrateful man. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know I understand now." I read his letter, and tears fell onto the paper, not from anger, but from compassion. Because finally, the son I had raised for so many years had truly grown up, though the price had been far too high. I didn't reply, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew time would teach him the lessons my words could not. A month later, Daniel contacted Lewis, my lawyer. He said he wanted to return the house keys, sign a new lease, and pay rent independently. Lewis later told me he's not the same. He's thinner, quieter, and genuinely remorseful. I said nothing, but inside me, something warm flickered to life, like a small flame in a cold night. Time passed. The headlines about the wealthy mother betrayed by her son slowly faded. As for me, I moved into a small apartment by Lake Geneva, the city where my father once lived. In the mornings, I walked beneath the trees, listening to the distant church bells. No one here knew who I was. No one knew that my story had once set the internet ablaze. I was simply an old woman with silver hair who liked painting and chamomile tea in the afternoon. But sometimes, I still remember. The years of motherhood, the nights waiting for Daniel to come home late, the times I sat by his bed when he was sick, that love had never vanished. It simply slept deep in the quiet corners of my heart. One afternoon, I received another letter, shorter this time, but far heavier. "Mom, I'm in therapy now. The doctor says I need to learn how to forgive myself. However, I know I must start by apologizing to you, not so you'll forget, but so I can remember how to be human again. I hope you're at peace. Even if you never want to see me again, I'll always be grateful. Your son, Daniel." I read it, and this time I smiled. Not because I had forgiven him, but because I felt something I had longed for all my life. Daniel had finally understood the meaning of love and respect. I didn't write him back, but I sent a small envelope through my lawyer. Inside was a card with 2 simple handwritten lines. "I forgave you long ago, but forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the past. Live well, my son." A few months later, I heard that Daniel had moved to a small town. He was working as an engineer for an electronics company. The salary wasn't high, but it was enough. People said he lived quietly now, no longer boasting, chasing appearances. As for Sophie, she disappeared from the public eye, left the city, and no one knew where she went. Everything ended quietly, like a play whose curtain falls without applause. One morning, I sat in a small cafe by the lake. It was raining softly outside. I watched people passing by, then opened the journal I still wrote in every day. I wrote, "I used to think forgiveness was weakness, but now I know forgiveness is freedom, not to comfort others, but to free myself." I began writing a book, not to complain, but to share. The book was titled When I Retired from Being a Mother. It told the story of a woman learning to love herself after a lifetime of living for others. When it was published, I received thousands of letters from around the world from mothers, sons, and people who had once hurt those they loved. They wrote that the story made them reflect, made them want to call their mothers to say thank you or I'm sorry. And I realized that perhaps the best thing I had ever done was not revenge, but turning my pain into a lesson for others. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, I sat by the window, watching the still surface of the lake. I thought of Daniel, but this time, the memory didn't burn. It felt gentle, warm. I realized that true love is when you are strong enough to let go and kind enough to forgive, because sometimes only when we stop holding on do others begin to move forward. I closed my journal softly and whispered to myself, I don't regret loving my son. I only regret forgetting myself for so long. But now, I found the woman I once was, and she, at last, is alive. 2 years have passed since I left my old city. Now I live in a small apartment by Lake Geneva, where morning fog covers the water like a soft blanket. I've grown used to the peace, mornings with books, afternoons with long walks, evenings with classical music. People often say that time heals all wounds, but I don't believe that. Wounds never disappear. They simply become part of who we are, like a scar on the hand or a wrinkle at the corner of the eye. The difference is that we learn to look at them without pain. One autumn morning, I received a small package. Inside was a photo frame. In the picture, Daniel was smiling, standing among a group of children in a workshop. On the back, a note was written in his familiar, messy handwriting. Mom, I've become a mentor for a public school engineering class. These kids remind me of who I used to be. Thank you for not letting go too soon and for not holding on too long. I sat for a long time, looking at that photo. The wind stirred the curtains, carrying the faint scent of lavender through the room. I smiled softly, not because Daniel had changed, but because I could finally think of him and feel peace. That night, I stepped out onto the balcony, watching the city lights shimmer across the still lake. Everything was quiet. No more arguments, no more tears, no more noise from the online world, only the wind and the steady, calm beating of my heart. I thought back to it all. The day I was turned away at his wedding. The sleepless nights were filled with hurt. The moment I stood up and took back my dignity. And the day I chose forgiveness, just to keep living. If someone asked whether I regretted anything, I would say no, because sometimes loss is the only way we rediscover what truly matters. Many people wrote to me after reading When I Retired from Being a Mother. They shared their own stories. Some said they had called their mothers after years of silence. Some admitted they finally realized how ungrateful they'd been. And some mothers told me they'd finally found the courage to say no for the first time in their lives. I read every letter and understood my story was not mine alone. It was the voice of millions who had given their lives to family and were now learning to love themselves again. Family isn't always peaceful, but it is where we first learn about love and where we discover the power of forgiveness. I am no longer a resentful mother. I am a woman who has learned to walk out of the darkness and to use my own story as a light for others. One winter afternoon, I met Louis again, my friend, my lawyer, the man who had stood by me through every storm. He looked at me and smiled gently. "Margaret, you've truly rewritten your life." I replied, "Not rewritten, just continued it in a better way." We sat by the window watching the snow fall. I said, "You know, there's something I've learned after all of this. Forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it does change the future." Louis nodded quietly. I smiled, looking out the window. On the lake, snow fell, melted, and blended into the water, just as all pain eventually dissolves into stillness. I stood up and gently closed the window. Warm golden light filled the room. I opened my journal and wrote the final line of my story. I once thought living for others was happiness. Now I understand. Living well for myself is the greatest gift I can give to those I love. If you're listening to this story, take a moment to think of those who once loved you, a parent, a friend, or someone who quietly stood behind your life, unseen. And if you are someone who carries the weight of the world for others, remember you, too, deserve love, respect, and the right to live for yourself. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. If you wish to hear more stories about family, gratitude, and healing, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue to share kindness and understanding, because sometimes just one story can change an entire heart.